Welcome to lecture number 45. The topic today is 5.3, the Mexican-American War. The theme is America in the World. The learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of the Mexican-American War. Before getting into the key concepts, we're going to do a quick overview of what the war was like, because the key concept outlined doesn't really focus on the chronological progression of the war, though it is important and it makes more sense knowing how the events of the war played out. The cause of the war is over the annexation of Texas. Texas joins the United States in 1845, and the southern boundary of Texas was still disputed between Texas and Mexico after its independence 9 years earlier. Mexico said that the boundary was a lot further north, giving Mexico more territory. Texas said that the boundary was further south down to the Rio Grande, giving Texas and the United States more territory. So the United States sends troops into the disputed territory, who encounter Mexican soldiers, and a small battle ensues. American soldiers die in the skirmish, and it's enough for the rest of the country to call for a war. There were politicians and famous Americans who dissented against this war. Abraham Lincoln, at the time, was a representative in the U.S. Congress. He introduced the spot resolution several times to try and determine whether American soldiers were actually in American soil when they were killed, or were they actually in Mexican territory, or at the very least, disputed Mexican territory when they were killed. Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, Henry David Thoreau, the transcendentalist, and then Henry Clay, the leader of the Whigs, also opposed the war. As far as the fighting of the war, the United States Army easily took over the territories in Mexico and California. Those efforts were led by General Kearny in New Mexico and also General Fremont in Northern California. Fremont will become more important as time goes on. He will run for president for the Republican Party in 1856. General Zachary Taylor's troops were the first ones to engage with Mexican troops near the Rio Grande, sparking the war. When the war began, he moved his troops south into northern Mexico, getting his largest victory at the Battle of Buena Vista against Mexican General Antonio de Santa Anna. General Zachary Taylor gains a lot of fame from the war and eventually runs for president under the Whig Party in 1848 and wins. Finally, General Winfield Scott sails to Veracruz, a coastal city on the Gulf of Mexico, and from there marches to capture the capital, Mexico City. Remember this amphibious attack, because Winfield Scott's going to be the general in charge of war strategy in the Civil War for the Union, and will try to use this in fighting against the Confederacy. As for the outcome, when Mexico City is captured by Winfield Scott, the fighting ends in 1847. The end of the war is negotiated with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that sets the New Mexico-U.S. border to be at the Rio Grande, which is still the modern-day border between Mexico and the United States. Additionally, all of the territory west of Texas was awarded to the United States, and the U.S. pays Mexico $15 million for that territory. They're also going to pay out any claims the Mexican citizens had against the U.S., which totaled around $3 million. With that background, we can move forward into the Mexican Cession. The United States added large territories in the West through victory in the Mexican-American War and diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. The Mexican Cession is the territory of California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and parts of New Mexico. The diplomatic negotiations include the annexation of Texas in 1845. President John Tyler used the annexation of Texas as a political tool against the Whig Party that had pulled their support leading into the 1844 election. Tyler submits a treaty for the annexation of Texas to the Senate before the presidential election and is defeated by the Whig majority for fear that it would divide the country over the issue of slavery. After the election, in which Polk wins, proposing an expansionist agenda, Tyler submits the treaty again to a lame duck Congress and gets it passed. The annexation becomes official when Tyler signs the approved treaty on his last day in office. When Polk succeeds Tyler, he signs the Oregon Treaty in 1846 with Great Britain, and in 1854 the United States carries out the Gadsden Purchase. It is a sliver of land south of Arizona, and it was purchased for $10 million from Mexico in order to be able to build a transcontinental railroad. There was already a northern route that was being planned that connected the Midwest to Northern California and San Francisco, but a southern route had been complicated by mountainous terrain. The question of slavery comes up as a result of the addition of territory. It is even more explosive with the introduction of the Wilmot Proviso. Southerners wanted to extend the institution of slavery into the newly won territories of the Mexican Cession. They were still bound by the Missouri Compromise line of the 3630 parallel, but they wanted to continue to move west. Those who were in the north, who were free soilers, wanted to keep slavery out of these new territories. Whigs opposed the war on mostly moral grounds, but there was a split within the Whig Party because they were a national party that included Southerners and Northerners. The political cartoon on the screen shows the two factions going in opposite directions, with the Wilmot Proviso being placed on the wagon wheel as an obstacle. The Wilmot Proviso would have kept slavery out of the Mexican Cession, but it never passed Congress. A compromise on slavery in the Mexican Cession won't come until 1850, that is brokered by Henry Clay. Finally, Mexicans in the annexed territory had the opportunity to gain full U.S. citizenship as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, while American Indians were not given that same opportunity. The treatment of Mexican Americans and American Indians is covered more fully in the next key concept. U.S. government interactions and conflict with Mexican Americans and American Indians increased in regions newly taken from American Indians in Mexico, altering these groups' economic self-sufficiency and cultures. The Californias are a group of people in California that were descendants of the Spanish and Mexicans in California. By the time that the Mexican-American War ended, there were about 13,000 of them in California. They were usually the most influential people in that territory. They were landed, they were wealthy, but as more and more American settlers came in, they started to lose influence. They did fight against the United States Army in the Battle of San Pascual, in which they defeated General Kearny right after the U.S. Army had finished crossing the Great Basin. Cultural influences are still present from New Mexico to California. There are remnants of Spanish and Mexican culture, especially in the architecture and the names of places. Old churches, the mission system, and Spanish architecture are still present throughout California and the Southwest today. As for California Indians, the new occupation of the Americans over California was detrimental to Native American populations. From 1845 to 1877, the Native American population in California plummets from 150,000 to 30,000 Native Americans. State officials advocated for their removal, as the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, in his State of the State address said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. The state of California, with the help of the federal government, pursued a policy of land dispossession and the use of reservations to displace natives from their traditional territories. The influx of settlers that were part of the gold rush displaced Native Americans and sometimes contaminated the ecosystems that they normally used for subsistence. In their displacement, some turned to looting and stealing horses, livestock, or crops that brings about disproportionate and indiscriminate violence against all Native groups. The violence was carried out by militia patrols that were armed and funded by the state. Later, the state would be reimbursed by the federal government. The U.S. government dealt with it by passing the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. It sanctioned legalized form of slavery for California Indians. Those that didn't have a job or a means of self-sufficiency would be hired out without pay, supposedly to keep them from looting. Alright, finally for the recap. The United States completed its goal of expanding to the Pacific by way of the Mexican-American War. The new territory fanned the flames on the debate of the expansion of slavery. And finally, Mexicans and Native Americans living in the newly acquired territory were affected differently by the American government. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.